The cold case that terrified an entire U.S. town for 30 years. Case: the 1991 yogurt shop murders, Austin, Texas. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because once you hear this story, you'll never forget it. This is the case that haunted an entire American city for more than 3 decades. A crime so cruel, so baffling, that even now the answers feel incomplete. December 6, 1991, Austin, Texas. A city known for its live music, its easygoing charm, and its reputation as a safe place to raise a family. But that Friday night would rip away Austin's sense of safety forever. The I Can't Believe It's Yogurt Shop was a small frozen yogurt parlor tucked into a quiet strip mall. It was the kind of place where parents felt comfortable dropping off their kids, where teenagers went after school, and where nothing bad was supposed to happen. That night, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison were working the late shift. Jennifer's 15-year-old sister Sarah and Sarah's 13-year-old friend Amy Ayers stopped by to keep them company. Just 4 girls, chatting, closing up shop, waiting for rides home. Sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, everything changed. At 12:08 a.m., smoke was spotted pouring from the yogurt shop. Firefighters rushed in, battling the blaze that had already begun tearing through the small building. When the flames died down, they expected to find nothing more than charred counters and melted machinery. Instead, they found the unimaginable. Inside, beneath the blackened remains of the store, were the bodies of all 4 girls. The crime scene was a nightmare. The store had been deliberately set ablaze, and the fire destroyed precious evidence. But even through the haze of smoke and soot, detectives could see enough to know that this was no accident. It was a calculated attack. 4 young lives stole, and in one of the most disturbing crimes Austin had ever seen. News spread fast. By morning, the city was in shock. Parents clutched their children tighter. Neighbors whispered about evil walking among them. Television crews swarmed the strip mall as grief-stricken families arrived, desperate for answers. The yogurt shop, once a cheerful hangout, was now a shrine of fear. For the Harbisons, their world had collapsed in a single night. They lost not 1, but 2 daughters. Sarah, bright and lively, and Jennifer, hard-working and responsible, were gone. For the Thomas family, the loss of Eliza shattered their home. And for the Ayers family, little Amy, just 13 years old, would never come back. Each family was left to grapple with unbearable grief, all while a city demanded justice. Police faced pressure like never before. The mayor's office wanted answers, the public wanted arrests, and detectives knew they were in a race against time. But the crime scene was chaos. The fire had destroyed fingerprints, DNA, and any chance of a clean investigation. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some said they saw strangers loitering around the shop earlier that evening. Others reported suspicious cars speeding off near closing time. But nothing lined up neatly. Still, leads began to emerge. A composite sketch was released of 2 young men seen near the store before the fire. Tips poured in, but none brought investigators closer to the truth. Austin, normally a city of open trust, became a place of suspicion. Rumors swirled. Parents warned their children not to stay out late. Everyone wanted to know, who could do this? Days turned into weeks, and fear settled over the community like a heavy fog. The funerals drew thousands, with mourners spilling into the streets. Reporters described the silence as unbearable. An entire city grieving together. But grief soon turned to frustration. Detectives admitted they were struggling. The case that should have shocked the killers into mistakes was instead growing colder by the day. By the end of 1991, Austin was trapped in a nightmare. Police insisted they were working around the clock, but no one was in custody. The families waited, haunted by unanswered questions. Who targeted their daughters? Why? And how had the killers slipped away into the night without leaving a trace? The yogurt shop murders had become more than a local crime. It was national news, broadcast on primetime television, dissected by crime reporters across the country. The brutality, the randomness, the vulnerability of the victims, It all combined into a story too horrifying to look away from, and the longer it went unsolved, the deeper the sense of dread grew. But as investigators would soon discover, this was only the beginning, because in their desperation to find answers, they would make mistakes that would not only derail the case for decades, but also risk convicting the wrong men. And behind it all, somewhere in the shadows, the real killer was still out there. The yogurt shop murders quickly became the obsession of Austin's law enforcement. Dozens of detectives pored over every shred of evidence, interviewing anyone who might have been in the strip mall that night. Yet, instead of clarity, the case only grew murkier. The first major break seemed promising. Several teenage boys who hung around the area became persons of interest. Police interrogated them for hours, pressing for answers. Eventually, under intense questioning, one of the young men, Maurice Pierce, confessed. He claimed he and 3 friends, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, and Forrest Wellborn, had been involved in the murders. For a grieving city, it felt like a relief. The nightmare was ending. But cracks in the confession appeared almost immediately. Pierce recanted, saying detectives had pressured him into admitting things he didn't do. The others denied any role at all. Still, investigators clung to the narrative. They believed they finally had their suspects, and Austin believed it too. By 1999, after years of frustration, prosecutors charged Scott and Springsteen. In dramatic courtroom scenes, jurors listened to recordings of their confessions. But those confessions raised troubling questions. Neither man could recall key details of the crime. Their stories contradicted one another, and they lacked any supporting evidence. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no physical link to place them inside the yogurt shop that night. All the prosecution had were words captured on tape, words critics argued had been shaped by coercive tactics. Still, in 2001, Robert Springsteen was convicted and sentenced to death. 2 years later, Michael Scott was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For the victims' families, the verdicts brought a measure of relief. The killers were behind bars, or so they thought. But in the background, science was moving faster than the case. DNA analysis, still primitive in the early 90s, had advanced dramatically by the 2000s. Investigators re-examined evidence from the yogurt shop, hoping to confirm once and for all that the right men had been caught. What they found instead sent shockwaves through the justice system. The DNA at the crime scene did not match Scott. It did not match Springsteen. It did not match Pierce or Wellborn. In fact, it didn't match anyone in the FBI's database. The physical evidence pointed to an unknown perpetrator, someone who had never been on trial. The implications were staggering. 2 men had been convicted in one of Austin's most infamous cases, but the hard science suggested they weren't guilty. For the victims' families, it was another devastating blow. Had justice been served, or had it been a tragic mistake? By 2009, after nearly a decade behind bars, both convictions were overturned. Scott and Springsteen walked free, their names forever tied to a crime the courts now admitted had not been proven against them. The yogurt shop murders were once again wide open, and the real killer, or killers, remained a ghost in the shadows. The release of the suspects reignited the city's fear. For years, Austin had believed the case was closed, the threat contained. But now, uncertainty returned. If Scott and Springsteen were innocent, then who had slaughtered 4 girls in cold blood, and why had they never struck again? Detectives faced a grim reality. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the murders, and the trail was ice cold. Witnesses had forgotten details. Potential suspects had scattered or died. Evidence had been lost or degraded. The mistakes of the early investigation, rushed interrogations, contaminated crime scenes, were irreversible. Yet the case refused to die. Journalists revisited it, crime shows featured it, and amateur sleuths dissected it online. Every one had theories. Some pointed to drifters and career criminals who had passed through Austin in the early 90s. Others believed the murders were the work of a local predator who blended back into the city after the crime. A few whispered about police misconduct, suggesting the truth was buried to protect reputations. Through it all, the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy endured endless cycles of hope and disappointment. Each time a new suspect emerged, they dared to believe justice was near. Each time those leads collapsed, the wounds reopened. By the mid-2010s, the yogurt shop murders had become one of the longest-running cold cases in Texas history. Detectives continued to chase down tips, but the years only deepened the mystery. The case was no longer just about 4 teenage girls. It was about a city haunted by questions that refused to be answered. And yet, even after nearly 3 decades, investigators would discover that the story wasn't over. In fact, the most shocking revelations were still to come. Nearly 3 decades had passed since that December night in 1991. The yogurt shop murders were no longer just a crime. They had become a wound carved into Austin's identity. The case was studied in law schools as a lesson in false confessions, dissected in documentaries as an example of investigative failure, and remembered by families as an unending nightmare. But by the 2020s, hope flickered again. Advances in DNA technology, particularly the rise of genealogical databases, were solving cases once thought unsolvable. Detectives across the country were suddenly closing cold cases using tiny fragments of genetic material that had sat useless for decades. Austin investigators wondered, could this case finally be among them? In 2025, that hope became reality. Analysts re-examined a single shell casing from the yogurt shop, one of the few pieces of evidence to survive the fire. Using cutting-edge ballistics, they discovered it matched casings from crimes committed by a man named Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers was no stranger to violence. He had been linked to assaults and murders across multiple states in the 1990s. He was a man who seemed to move like a phantom, leaving destruction behind him, always one step ahead of law enforcement. In 1999, cornered by police in Missouri, Brashers took his own life before he could be arrested. Forensic genealogists then tested DNA preserved under one of the victim's fingernails. The result was undeniable. It matched Brashers. After 33 years of agony, the trail had finally led to a name. The real killer had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, his crimes spanning state lines, his death robbing families of a trial. When authorities announced the breakthrough, the city of Austin was stunned. For the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, it was a moment of vindication, but also a cruel twist. The man responsible was beyond the reach of justice. There would be no confession, no courtroom testimony, no chance to see him held accountable. For the wrongfully accused, the revelation was equally haunting. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen had lost years of their lives to wrongful convictions. Their names had been smeared, their futures forever altered, all because investigators had latched onto flawed confessions instead of chasing the real killer. The yogurt shop. Murders now stand as both a tragedy and a warning. A tragedy because of the young lives cut short, the families left with scars, and a community forever haunted by what happened that night. A warning because it showed how desperation for answers can blind investigators, how justice rushed is often justice denied, and how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing. Today, if you drive past the site of the old yogurt shop, you won't find the cheerful storefront that once welcomed families. Instead, you'll find a quiet lot, marked by memory, more than by buildings. But for those who remember, the silence is deafening. It's a reminder of innocence lost, of 4 girls who never came home, and of the chilling reality that evil can walk among us unnoticed. The case is technically closed. The killer has been named. But closure, that's harder to come by. For the Harbison, Thomas, and Ayers families, nothing can erase the decades of grief, confusion, and unanswered questions. For Austin, the yogurt shop murders will forever remain a scar on the city's history. And for the rest of us, it's a story that lingers long after it ends. A story that proves some nightmares don't fade with time, they only grow darker. So remember this: justice delayed is justice denied. And sometimes the most terrifying killer is the one who almost got away.